what's the oldest known pollinating insect? Interesting question. Doesn't get asked super often, but it is one that is kind of relevant. After all, we know that pollinating insects in particular are extremely important to ecosystems all over the world. The relationship between these insects and the plants as they pollinate goes back millennia. You're probably aware that creatures like honeybees, for example, are key aspects of certain plants' life cycles. It's gotten to the point where these plants would have difficulty surviving if they ever disappeared, and vice versa. Their relationships are completely intertwined, but how far back does this go? After all, this sort of relationship would have had to evolve at some point. Sometime throughout the history of our planet, certain insects started, feeding on certain plants. Probably did that before the pollinating thing. But some plants, instead of evolving ways to combat them, fighting them, they would in fact utilize the relationship as a way of spreading their pollen. They would make food to attract the insects, like nectar, for example, and the insects would passively take pollen in the process to other plants. At some point, that happened. But when? Well, we aren't sure, but we know the earliest, at least at the moment, and it goes back 280 million years, involving a ground-dwelling insect called Tillyardembia. This now extinct genus of insect was sort of similar to what we'd call earwigs, and while they did technically possess wings, they probably weren't capable of proper sustained flight. It's believed they probably allowed them to hop, in a sense, but not actually consistently fly. Regardless, they lived in what is now Russia, and predate the previous early known pollinating insects by about 120 million years. A paleontologist named Alexander Kramov at the Borisiak Paleontological Institute in Moscow did a study with his colleague that looked over 425 fossils of this creature, and they wound up discovering that 6 of them had clumps of pollen trapped in their heads, legs, thoraxes, or abdomens. Basically, in places that they wouldn't otherwise be eating the pollen, it was just stuck to them. And that ratio probably sounds really small. Wait, just 6 out of 425? Is that really evidence? And the answer is yes, because these particular fossils were preserved in what was originally fine-grained sediments. The early stages of fossilization would have actually washed away pollen from the remains, so finding any at all suggests that this was a very normal thing to happen to the animals in the process of finding food. They only discovered a couple different types of pollen trapped on them. There was hardly any variation, which suggests that these insects were actually extremely selective in terms of what plants they were visiting. And this specialization is a key point here, because pollinators only visit certain plants. If they visited all varieties, the pollination wouldn't be very effective, since you'd be taking pollen that wouldn't be able to be used by most of the plants. But if you specialize and go to specific plants, then you're carrying the right pollen to the right plant more of the time. And it does seem to be the case with Tillyardembia. A paleoentomologist at the University of Kansas named Michael Engel concurred with the findings, especially the specialization point, and actually added that while it is clear that Tillyardembia is probably the earliest pollinator they're familiar with, they probably weren't the first. This sort of specialization likely goes back even further. We just haven't found any evidence for it at this point, which is a case with a lot of paleontology. There's many things that we can say, many things we can deduce, many things we can assume, but we need evidence, and it's very difficult to find it sometimes. But in this case, we have actually discovered evidence regarding pollinating insects all the way back 280 million years ago. Further investigation into the fossils might actually show that Tillyardembia had special pollen-trapping hairs, or something similar, that helped the pollen stick to them. There's no evidence for that at this point, but it would be further evidence that, yeah, these were definitely pollinating insects. And with that, a special thank you to my apex predators, Dr. Racer78, Metal for Life Guy, and Arthur Roy. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.